The cafeteria was picture perfect. Kids laughing, trays clattering. But in the corner, Laura ate alone, the deaf teacher who'd long stopped hopping anyone would talk to her. Then three girls stood up, triplets in matching blue dresses, hands already moving. What Laura didn't know, these sisters had spent weeks secretly learning sign language. In the next 30 seconds, in front of the entire cafeteria, they would sign something that would break every barrier in that room. Laura had taught at Edgewood Elementary for 5 years. She was brilliant, dedicated, deeply loved by her students. But in the teacher's lounge, the conversations happened too fast, lips moved without sound, and Laura's hearing aids couldn't bridge the gap. So she stopped trying. Every day, same corner table, same plastic tray, same silence, until three little girls noticed. Emma, Sophie, and Grace, identical triplets, blonde hair, matching blue dresses, watched their teacher eat alone and decided that wasn't okay. Their dad, Thomas, a single father raising three 5-year-olds on a mechanic's salary, noticed them watching. And when the girls asked to learn sign language, he found a way. For weeks they practiced in secret, small hands forming words in their bedroom mirror, determined to tell their teacher something no one else had ever told her. They had no idea their plan was about to be tested in the most public way imaginable. Laura had stopped believing anyone would try. She was 32 years old, a kindergarten and first-grade art teacher at Edgewood Elementary, a public school just outside Springfield, Illinois. The children adored her. She could make a paintbrush feel like a magic wand, and her classroom was the only place in the building where silence didn't feel like a wall. She had been born with moderate hearing loss, but a bout of meningitis at age 7 stole most of what remained. By high school, she wore a powerful hearing aid in her right ear and read lips with precision, but group conversations were a blur and crowded rooms overwhelmed her. She learned to smile, nod, and disappear. The school hired her straight out of college, and for 5 years she showed up early, stayed late, and ate lunch alone. Not because she wanted to, because no one invited her. The other teachers had their clusters, the third-grade team at the round table, the fourth-grade crew by the windows, the PE coaches laughing by the vending machines. Laura sat at a small table in the far corner, same spot every day, her back to the wall so she could see the whole room. She told herself it was a choice. It was. The isolation had become a familiar ache, like a song she couldn't stop humming. Her burgundy turtleneck, her straight dark hair tucked behind her ear to keep the hearing aid visible, her hands resting quietly on the table. Those details became the background noise of the cafeteria, ignored by adults but not by children. Three children in particular. Emma, Sophie, and Grace were identical triplets, 5 years old, with blonde hair that fell just past their shoulders and a habit of finishing each other's sentences. They were in Laura's art class every Tuesday and Thursday, and they noticed everything. They noticed that their teacher never sat with the other teachers. They noticed that no one ever waved to her across the room. They noticed that when the cafeteria got loud and the other grown-ups laughed in groups, Miss Laura's eyes would drift down to her tray, and something in her face would go still. And one Tuesday afternoon in late October, as their dad Thomas picked them up from school, Emma asked the question that would set everything in motion. "Daddy, why is Miss Laura always alone?" Thomas gripped the steering wheel of his 10-year-old pickup. He was a mechanic, 43 years old, with a short beard and permanent grease stains under his fingernails. He had been raising the girls alone since his wife walked out when they were 18 months old. He didn't have a lot of answers, but he always tried to give them the truth. "She's deaf, sweetheart. She can't hear like we do, and it makes it hard to talk to people." Sophie, in her booster seat, crinkled her nose. "But we could talk to her, Daddy. We could learn her words." Thomas had no idea what that meant. He didn't know sign language, had never met a deaf person before Laura, and honestly didn't think much about it until that moment. But his daughters wouldn't let it go. That night at dinner, Grace set down her fork and said, "We want to tell Miss Laura she's ours." "Ours how?" Thomas asked. "Ours like we're hers and she's ours," Emma said, as if it were obvious. "Because nobody else says it." The next morning, Thomas called the Illinois School for the Deaf and asked for resources. A patient woman named Angela sent him a list of beginner signs, free online videos, and a recommendation for a local interpreter who offered family sessions. Thomas sat with his daughters at the kitchen table that first weekend and pulled up a video of the alphabet. "We're going to learn this together," he said. The girls were electrified. They had never been allowed to watch so many videos, and they absorbed the signs like sponges. Emma, always the leader, mastered the fingerspelling of her name in under an hour. Sophie, the most empathetic, practiced emotions: happy, sad, friend, love. Grace, who struggled with shyness, found that her hands could say things her voice couldn't. Thomas watched them and felt a lump in his throat. He had spent 4 years terrified he was failing as a father, and here were his bobbies trying to love someone who wasn't even in their family. He scraped together $80 for a private tutoring session with an interpreter named Maria, who came to their house on a Saturday morning in November. She taught them the sign for "You are our friend." The girls practiced it until their wrists ached. They signed it in their bedroom mirror, signed it to their stuffed animals, signed it silently across the dinner table while Thomas did the dishes and tried not to cry. But learning was only half the challenge. They had to keep it a secret. "We can't tell anyone," Emma insisted. "It has to be a surprise or it won't count." Sophie nodded gravely. "Surprise love is the strongest love." Thomas had no idea where they got that, but he honored it. He didn't tell their teachers, didn't post on social media, didn't even mention it to his own brother. The weeks that followed were a tightrope. The girls would rush home every day and practice new signs, chain words into phrases, learn the difference between "you are our friend" and "you are our person." They wanted to say something bigger than just "friend," something permanent. And all the while they watched Laura. They watched her in the hallway, smiling at students but never stopping to chat with colleagues. They watched her in the cafeteria, alone again, same corner, same tray, same silence. They noticed that some of the other teachers didn't even glance her way. Not because they were cruel, Thomas believed that, but because they had stopped seeing her. Laura had become invisible, and that, the girls decided, was the worst thing they had ever witnessed. By early December, they were ready. The girls had practiced the phrase 30, 40, maybe 50 times. Thomas bought them matching blue dresses, not expressly for this, but because they had outgrown their old ones and he found a deal at the consignment shop. The girls latched onto those dresses as their uniform. "These are our Miss Laura clothes," Grace announced. On December 6th, a Friday, Thomas drove them to school with a knot in his stomach. The plan was simple. At lunch, they would walk over to Laura's table, wait until she looked up and sign their message. Simple, except nothing about this was simple. The cafeteria would be packed, kids shouting, trays clattering, teachers scattered, and 3 tiny girls standing in a row were about to attempt something no adult in that building had ever tried. Thomas kissed them goodbye at the drop-off line. "You sure about this?" Emma, already unbuckling her seatbelt, looked at him with the steadiest eyes he'd ever seen on a 5-year-old. "Daddy, she's waited long enough." He watched them walk inside, 3 blonde heads in identical blue, and felt his heart crack open with pride and terror. He wasn't allowed inside for lunch, school policy, but he decided to wait in the parking lot anyway, just in case. Inside, the morning passed like any other. The girls made paper snowflakes in art class and watched Laura demonstrate the scissors with careful, deliberate movements, her hands so graceful they could have been their own language. They exchanged glances across the room, a silent conversation only triplets could have. Then the lunch bell rang. The cafeteria filled with noise. Laura took her usual seat, her back to the wall, her tray untouched in front of her. She was thinking about her next lesson plan, not about being lonely, because she had trained herself not to think about that. And then, from across the room, 3 small figures stood up. The noise didn't stop, but something shifted. Heads turned. Emma, Sophie, and Grace walked in a tight triangle, their hands clasped, their faces set with the same focused tenderness they had practiced in their bedroom mirror. They moved through the chaos of the cafeteria like a thread pulling silence into the room. Thomas, watching through the glass doors of the school entrance with permission from the front office, held his breath. Laura looked up and saw them coming. She smiled, confused, her hand instinctively rising to adjust her hearing aid. The girl stopped 3 feet from her table and Emma stepped forward, her small hands already rising, the first sign forming on her fingertips. The entire cafeteria was about to witness something that would change Laura's life forever. But before she could understand what was happening, Laura's worst fear unfolded in the corner of her eye. Her loudest critic, the assistant principal, was bearing down on the girls with a scowl that said, "Not here, not now asterisk." And in that split second, everything hung in the balance. The assistant principal's name was Mrs. Hendricks. She was a tall woman with a sharp jaw and a reputation for enforcing rules like scripture. She had noticed the three girls crossing the cafeteria floor, and she saw a disruption. Lunch was a structured period. Children sat with their classes, supervised by aides. These girls were from kindergarten, and they were walking directly toward the teacher's corner, which was off-limits for students without permission. Mrs. Hendricks moved like a predator, weaving through tables, mouth already forming a reprimand. "Girls, return to your seats immediately." Her voice was loud enough to cut through the noise, but Emma didn't turn. Sophie didn't flinch. Grace, the most timid, tightened her grip on her sister's hands. They had practiced for this moment. Not for an angry adult, but for the moment Laura saw them. And Laura did see them. She looked up from her tray, confusion flickering. Three blonde girls in matching blue, hands clasped, walking toward her with the purposeful stride of people who had something important to say. Then she saw Mrs. Hendricks closing in, and her stomach dropped. Laura knew that scowl. She had been on the receiving end of it many times, during staff meetings when she'd asked for a closed caption interpreter that the budget couldn't afford, in the hallway when she'd paused too long trying to read a colleague's lips. Mrs. Hendricks was not patient with difference. "Girls," Mrs. Hendricks barked, now only 10 feet away. "I said return to your seats. This is not playtime." Emma stopped. But she didn't turn around. Instead, she let go of Grace's hand and raised both of hers. In full view of the entire cafeteria, she began to sign. Laura's breath caught. She knew that first sign. It was the sign for U. Then Sophie joined, her small fingers forming the sign for R. Grace, trembling but determined, completed the phrase, "Our friend." Laura's hand flew to her mouth. The three girls stood in a row, their blue dresses like a banner, and together they signed the message they had practiced for weeks. "You are our friend." And then Emma, the leader, added a variation. She signed, "You are ours." The cafeteria had gone quiet. The noise of trays and laughter had dissolved into a strange, charged silence. Even the kitchen staff paused, hands frozen above steaming pans. Mrs. Hendricks stood motionless, her scowl cracking into something like bewilderment. Laura stared at the girls, tears already spilling down her cheeks. She had spent 5 years in this school, invisible. She had learned to accept that conversations would never include her, that she would eat alone, that she was tolerated but not embraced. And now, 3 5-year-olds, 3 tiny, identical girls who had no reason to care, had just told her she belonged. She rose from her seat. Her hands, so often still in this room, began to move. She signed back, "You are my friends too." The girls understood. They rushed toward her, a tangle of blonde hair and blue cotton, and Laura knelt to catch them. The cafeteria erupted, not with noise, at least not at first. There were gasps. A few students started clapping, then a table of 5th graders stood up and cheered. Teachers looked at each other, some with tears, some with visible shame. A 4th grade teacher named Mrs. Delgado, who had never once sat with Laura, covered her face with her hands. The camera phone came out a few seconds later. A cafeteria aide named Rosa had been holding her phone to text her son, and she caught the tail end of the moment. The 3 girls hugging Laura, the teacher's face wet with tears, the unmistakable sign for hours still visible on Emma's fingers. Rosa wasn't thinking about viral videos. She was thinking about her own grandmother, who had been deaf and who had spent her final years in silence. She hit record again and captured Laura pulling back to look at each girl individually, signing "thank you" over and over. Thomas, standing at the school entrance doors with his nose pressed against the glass, saw his daughters engulfed in Laura's arms, and he cried. He wasn't a man who cried easily. Not when his wife left, not when the transmission on his truck died, not when the bills piled up, but now tears ran freely down his cheeks and into his beard. He had raised these girls alone, and in this moment he understood that they had become better people than he ever imagined. Mrs. Hendricks finally retreated. She didn't speak. She walked briskly to the principal's office, her heels clicking with a different kind of urgency. The principal, Dr. Alan Peters, was at his desk when she burst in. "We have a situation," she said. "Three girls disrupted the lunch period, entered the teacher's section without authorization, and caused a scene." Meanwhile, the video was already uploading. Rosa posted it to her Facebook page with the caption, "This is my school. I've never been prouder." Within an hour, it had been shared 300 times. By the time the final bell rang, the local news station had called the front office. The story was simple and devastating. A deaf teacher ate alone every day. Three triplet girls learned sign language in secret. They walked up to her in the cafeteria and told her she was theirs. And the school administration's first response was to call it a disruption. That detail, the assistant principal's attempt to stop them, surfaced when Rosa gave her account to a reporter. She was going to send them back to their seats, Rosa said, but they were too fast. They had God in their hands. The next morning, the video had 500,000 views. National outlets picked it up. Good Morning America called. The school district superintendent, a woman named Dr. Lori Chen, held an emergency press conference at 9 a.m., her face carefully composed. "We are immensely proud of these students and the compassion they showed. Edgewood Elementary is committed to an inclusive environment for all staff and students." But behind closed doors, the conversation was very different. Dr. Chen had called Dr. Peters at 6 that morning. "Why am I learning about a teacher being isolated for years from a viral video?" she demanded. "Get me a full report by Monday." The staff meeting that Friday was the most uncomfortable gathering Edgewood Elementary had ever seen. The teachers sat in clusters, the same clusters they always sat in. But now the air was thick with unspoken guilt. Laura was not present. She had been asked to meet with the superintendent later that day, a request that left her anxious and uncertain. The girls were in class, unaware of the firestorm they had started. Thomas had been contacted by 6 news outlets, 2 morning shows, and a publisher interested in a children's book. He turned them all down. He had one concern: would his daughters get in trouble? That afternoon, Dr. Peters called Thomas and asked him to come to the school. The assistant principal wanted to discuss the incident. Thomas sat in his truck outside the school for 10 minutes, gripping the wheel. He hadn't slept. He'd spent the night tossing, terrified that his girl's beautiful gesture had somehow backfired. He walked into the building and saw Mrs. Hendricks standing in the hallway, arms crossed. "Mr. Foster, thank you for coming." She didn't smile. She led him to a small conference room. Laura was already there, seated at the far end of the table, her face pale. She was twisting a tissue in her hands. The only other person present was Dr. Peters, who sat at the head of the table looking deeply uncomfortable. Thomas took a seat opposite Laura. "Where are my daughters?" "They're in class," Dr. Peters said. "They're fine. This meeting is about process." "Process," Thomas repeated. Mrs. Hendricks sat down and folded her hands on the table. "Mr. Foster, what your daughters did was well-intentioned, but lunch is a supervised period. Students are not permitted to leave their designated areas without permission." The girls approached a staff member in a way that could have, she paused, choosing her words, "that could have been disruptive to the order of the school." Thomas stared at her. "Disruptive? We have rules for a reason," Mrs. Hendricks continued. "If every student decided to stage a surprise during lunch, we would have chaos. The girls must understand that kindness doesn't excuse breaking protocol." Laura's hand stilled on the tissue. Her eyes were fixed on Mrs. Hendricks's lips, reading every word. Thomas leaned forward. "Let me get this straight. My daughters spent weeks learning a language because they saw a teacher being ignored by every adult in this building. They did what nobody here bothered to do for 5 years, and you're calling them disruptive." The room went silent. Dr. Peters cleared his throat. "We're not punishing them. We're simply reviewing the situation. The video has brought a lot of attention. We need to manage that attention carefully." "Manage it," Thomas said. "You mean protect yourselves." Laura raised a hand, a quiet gesture that silenced the room. She looked at Thomas, then at Mrs. Hendricks. She pulled out a small notepad from her pocket and wrote quickly, then turned it around. The words read, "The girls did nothing wrong. If anyone broke protocol, it was me by allowing myself to be invisible." She set the pen down and looked directly at Mrs. Hendricks. The assistant principal's face went rigid. Dr. Peters stepped in, voice diplomatic. No one is blaming anyone, we just want to move forward constructively. Laura, you are a valued teacher. The girls are wonderful students. We need to ensure the media narrative doesn't harm the school. Thomas saw it then, the real fear. Not that the girls had broken a rule, but that the world had seen the truth of how Laura had been treated, and the school's reputation was now in the hands of 3 kindergartners. He stood up. My daughters aren't going to apologize, and if you try to make them, I'll have every news van in the state parked outside this building by morning. Mrs. Hendricks opened her mouth, but Dr. Peters held up a hand. No one is asking for an apology. Good, Thomas said. He looked at Laura and something passed between them, 2 people who had fought their own lonely battles and suddenly recognized an ally. Can I talk to Laura alone? The principal hesitated, then nodded. Mrs. Hendricks left without a word. When they were alone, Laura wrote another note. Thank you for believing them. Thomas shook his head. They believed in you first. And then, as if on cue, the door opened. Emma, Sophie, and Grace stood in the doorway, their teacher having brought them down from class, each holding a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures in blue and a taller one in red. We drew our family, Emma announced. It's you, Miss Laura, and us and Daddy. Laura's tears returned, but this time she was smiling. The storm was far from over. Mrs. Hendricks was already drafting a formal incident report. The school board was scheduling an emergency session. And somewhere in the district office, a personnel file was being quietly reviewed, not the girls, but Laura's. Because when institutions feel exposed, they don't always thank the truth-tellers. Sometimes they punish them. And nobody knew yet what that would mean for the woman who finally, after 5 years, had been seen. The incident report landed on the superintendent's desk by Monday morning. It was 6 pages long, authored by Mrs. Hendricks, and it did not mention the word deaf once. Instead, it described a premeditated disruption of cafeteria operations by 3 kindergarten students who left their designated area without authorization and engaged an on-duty staff member in an unsanctioned interaction. The recommended disciplinary action: 1-day in-school suspension for Emma, Sophie, and Grace Foster, and a formal review of Laura Chen's professional boundaries. When Thomas received the email notification from the school's automated system, Emma Foster has been assigned a disciplinary infraction, he nearly put his fist through the drywall. He called the school. No answer. He called the district office. A receptionist told him Dr. Chen was unavailable. So he did the only thing left. He drove to the local news station and asked to speak with someone, anyone, who would listen. The reporter who met him in the lobby was a young woman named Kayla Vance. She had been covering school board meetings and ribbon cuttings, desperate for a story that mattered. Thomas sat across from her in a small conference room and told her everything. The weeks of secret practice, the interpreter they hired with grocery money he didn't have, the way his daughters had come home every night with their wrists aching because they practiced "You Are Ours" until they couldn't hold a fork. He told her about Laura's 5 years of isolation, the teachers who never once sat with her, the assistant principal who had tried to stop the girls mid-message. And then he showed her the email. Kayla Vance stopped taking notes. She was crying. The segment aired that evening. Edgewood Elementary is punishing 3 5-year-old girls for learning sign language to befriend their deaf teacher. The anchor's voice was incredulous. The station had obtained a copy of the incident report from a source inside the school. Rosa, the cafeteria aide who had posted the original video, had taken a photo of it with her phone before it left the office. The report hit the public with the force of a bomb. Within 2 hours, the school district's Facebook page was flooded with comments. The hashtag #LetThem sign started trending in Illinois. A deaf advocacy organization called Hands and Voices issued a statement condemning the school. A GoFundMe for the triplets' college fund, started by a stranger in Arizona, raised $20,000 overnight. And then the national outlets returned, but this time the story had changed. It was no longer just a heartwarming moment. It was an institution circling the wagons against a child-led act of kindness. The triplets became miniature folk heroes. Someone photoshopped their faces onto the cover of Time magazine. Someone else sent Thomas a check for $500 with a note, "For blue dresses, buy extras." Inside the district office, the mood was panic. Dr. Lori Chen, the superintendent who had issued the careful statement about pride and inclusion, was now facing a full-scale crisis. She summoned Dr. Peters and Mrs. Hendricks to a closed-door meeting. "You wrote up kindergartners," she said, her voice tight. "You wrote them up. For what?" "For walking across a room to say hello to a teacher in a language she could understand." Mrs. Hendricks did not flinch. "The report was procedural. Rules exist for safety. If a student had been injured while unsupervised—" "Unsupervised," Dr. Chen interrupted. "There were 4 aides and a dozen teachers in that room. The only thing unsupervised is the complete absence of human decency this school has shown for half a decade." The room went silent. Dr. Peters looked at the floor. He had been principal for 7 years. He had never once asked Laura how she was doing. He had never once noticed she ate alone. By Wednesday, the district announced that the in-school suspension recommendation had been reviewed and withdrawn. They did not mention Mrs. Hendricks, but rumors were already circulating that she had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into the school's compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. A former teacher from Edgewood, now retired, contacted the press and said, "I'm not surprised. That woman has been ignoring Laura's needs since the day she was hired. I filed 3 complaints about the lack of interpreter services for staff meetings, and all 3 were dismissed." The story wasn't just about the triplets anymore. It was about a pattern. Year after year, the school had denied Laura's requests for reasonable accommodations. No real-time captioning. No sign language interpreters. Not even a simple agreement to hold staff meetings in smaller groups where she could lip-read effectively. The isolation wasn't an accident. It was the logical result of an administration that had decided, implicitly, that she wasn't worth the effort. Laura was called to testify at a school board meeting on Thursday night. She had never spoken at a public forum before. Her voice, shaped by a lifetime of hearing loss, was sometimes hard for strangers to understand, but that night the room was packed with people who leaned forward and listened. She stood at the microphone in her burgundy turtleneck, her hearing aid visible, and she did not use sign language. She wanted everyone to hear her actual words. "I have been a teacher at Edgewood for 5 years. I love my students. I love my classroom, but I have never felt like I belonged in that building. I have eaten alone more than 1,000 times. I have smiled through meetings where I understood nothing. I have stopped asking for help because asking is exhausting when no one answers. I am not invisible, I am deaf." And those 3 little girls were the first people in that school to treat those 2 things as different. The room erupted in applause. Thomas, sitting in the 3rd row with the triplets on his lap, felt the vibration of the clapping through the floor. Emma leaned up and whispered, "Daddy, is Miss Laura okay?" "She's okay now, baby," he said. "She's finally okay." But the board had not yet voted, and behind the scenes, a final, desperate effort was underway. An attorney for the district had advised Dr. Chen that Laura might have grounds for a discrimination lawsuit. That terrified the insurance carrier. To limit liability, the district would need to demonstrate immediate corrective action, which could mean offering Laura a generous settlement and reassigning her to a different school, effectively removing the problem from Edgewood without actually fixing anything. Or it could mean firing Mrs. Hendricks and implementing real change. The board was divided. The night before the vote, Thomas and the triplets brought dinner to Laura's apartment, a small 1-bedroom with walls covered in student artwork. It was the first time she had ever had guests from work in her home. The girls explored every corner while Thomas set out pizza on the coffee table. Laura signed "thank you" and then wrote on a whiteboard, "I'm scared. If they send me to another school, I start over, alone again." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "Then we'll go with you," he said. "The girls and me, we'll transfer. We'll be your family at the new school." Laura's eyes filled. She picked up her pen. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Thomas said. "I know my daughters love you. That's all I need." It was the first time in 5 years that Laura believed someone might actually follow through. The school board vote was set for Friday at 6 p.m. The auditorium was overflowing. Local news crews had set up cameras in the back, and a live stream had been launched on the district's website with 20,000 viewers waiting. Laura sat in the front row, flanked by Thomas and the girls in fresh blue dresses, donated by a boutique that had seen the story. Mrs. Hendricks was not present. Neither was Dr. Peters, who had submitted his resignation that morning, effective immediately. The board president, a silver-haired man named Gerald Morrison, gavelled the meeting to order. "We are here tonight to address the incident at Edgewood Elementary and the subsequent findings of our internal investigation. We will also consider a motion to adopt a district-wide policy on inclusive communication and accessibility for all staff and students." The tension in the room was unbearable. Then a motion was made. A comprehensive accessibility plan including full interpreter services for all staff meetings, mandatory sensitivity training, and the creation of a new position, Director of Inclusive Practices, with Laura as the permanent consultant. Another motion followed, a formal apology from the board to Laura Chen and the Foster family. Then the final motion, the termination of Assistant Principal Deborah Hendricks, effective immediately, for conduct unbecoming and repeated failure to comply with federal accessibility mandates. The votes were unanimous. The room exploded. Laura collapsed into Thomas's shoulder, sobbing in a way she hadn't allowed herself since childhood. The girls climbed onto the board table and started signing friend, friend, friend at the bemused members. Gerald Morrison, a grandfather of 7, signed it back to them, badly but earnestly. But the real shock came the following week. The story had sparked a national conversation, and donations were pouring into deaf advocacy groups. An anonymous donor, moved by the news coverage, contributed $200,000 to establish a scholarship at the Illinois School for the Deaf, named the Emma, Sophie, and Grace Foster Scholarship, for children who wanted to become teachers. And Laura received an official letter from the governor's office, inviting her to join a new state task force on inclusive education. All because 3 little girls had decided that ours was the most important word in any language. And then on a bright Tuesday morning 3 months later, Laura walked into the Edgewood Elementary cafeteria and stopped dead in her tracks. The entire staff was standing at her table, her corner table, the one that had been a monument to her isolation, and every single one of them was signing. Not perfectly, not fluently, but they had spent the last 12 weeks in mandatory classes and they had something to say. The 3rd grade teacher stepped forward and signed, "Will you sit with us?" Laura's hand went to her mouth, her burgundy turtleneck catching the light, tears already forming. She signed back yes, and for the first time in 5 years, the corner table was full. But the story wasn't over, because on the other side of the cafeteria, a new teacher had just arrived. A young woman with a cochlear implant who had watched the whole thing on the news from 2 states away and applied to Edgewood specifically because of Laura. She was standing at the entrance, nervous and hopeful, and Emma, Sophie, and Grace were already watching her with the same fierce attention they had once given their art teacher. History was about to repeat itself. Only this time, no one was going to wait. The new teacher's name was Miriam. She was 27 years old, fresh out of a master's program in deaf education, and she had driven from Ohio to Illinois on the strength of a viral video and a gut feeling that Edgewood Elementary was where she was supposed to be. Her first day was a Monday in late March. She walked into the cafeteria with her lunch tray and paused, scanning the room. She had heard the stories, how Miss Laura had eaten alone for 5 years, how the teachers had ignored her, how 3 kindergartners had changed everything. She expected awkwardness. She expected to sit by herself, at least for a while, because new people always had to prove themselves. What she didn't expect was what actually happened. The triplets saw her first. Emma, Sophie, and Grace were now in 1st grade, older, slightly taller, their blonde hair still matching, their blue dresses replaced by a rotating wardrobe of whatever Thomas could find at the consignment shop, but their attention had not dimmed. They had been watching for new people ever since the school board meeting, because they had learned something profound. Adults didn't always notice loneliness, but anyone could be the next person who needed to be told they belonged. So when Miriam appeared in the doorway, the three girls exchanged a look, stood up from their table and walked toward her with the same purposeful stride they had once aimed at Laura's corner table. Miriam froze. She knew these girls. She had seen them on the news, watched the video a dozen times, cried into her coffee while their small hands shaped the words that had launched a movement. Now they were walking toward her, and she had no idea what they were about to do. The girls stopped in front of her. Emma signed first, her hands fluid after months of practice. "Welcome to our school," Sophie added. "We are happy you are here." Grace, still the most reserved, signed the phrase that had started everything. "You are ours now." Miriam's hands flew to her face. The cochlear implant processor, visible behind her ear, caught the light. She had been signing since childhood, but she had never been greeted like this by anyone under the age of 30. She knelt to their level and signed back. "You are the girls from the video." Emma nodded, beaming. "We're the ones, and if anyone is mean to you, tell us." The cafeteria watched the exchange with something that had become familiar at Edgewood, a quiet, breath-held reverence. Teachers who had once ignored Laura now watched with tears in their eyes. The cafeteria aides who had witnessed the original transformation stood still as statues. And Laura, seated at a table that was no longer a corner table because the whole seating arrangement had been restructured into a circle in the center of the room, rose and walked over. She signed to Miriam. "They adopted you already." Miriam laughed through her tears. "I think they did." The school had changed. Not just the seating chart, but the entire culture. After the board vote, the new accessibility policy had been implemented with surprising speed. Every staff meeting now included a sign language interpreter. All printed materials were available in large print and screen reader compatible formats. The mandatory sensitivity training had been uncomfortable for some. Teachers had to confront their own complicity in Laura's isolation, but it had cracked open a door that couldn't be closed again. The teacher's lounge, once a place where conversations flew past Laura like radio static, now had small whiteboards at every table, and a surprising number of staff members had started learning basic signs. Not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to. Laura's role had expanded beyond art teacher. The district had created the director of inclusive practices position, as the board had voted, and Laura now spent half her week consulting with other schools, helping them audit their environments for hidden barriers. She had become a public speaker, a reluctant celebrity who still wore the same burgundy turtleneck to every event because it reminded her of the day everything changed. She had been interviewed by national magazines, featured on podcasts, and invited to speak at a conference on deaf rights in Washington, D.C. She had said yes to all of it, because every platform was a chance to ensure that no other teacher would eat alone for half a decade. But the most profound change was personal. Thomas and Laura had spent months orbiting each other, parent-teacher conferences, school events, the occasional pizza dinner with the triplets, and somewhere along the way the orbit had tightened. They were not dating, not exactly. They were two people who had been broken by life in different ways, who had found each other through the fierce love of three little girls, and who were slowly learning that it was okay to need someone again. Thomas still wore his grease-stained work shirts to school pickup. Laura still adjusted her hearing aid when conversations got loud, but they had started sitting together at school functions, and the triplets had started drawing pictures that included Miss Laura inside the same house as theirs. The girls were thriving. The GoFundMe college fund had been transferred into a trust, managed by a financial advisor who had offered his services pro bono after seeing the story. The scholarship at the Illinois School for the Deaf had received its first applicant, a 16-year-old girl named Jada who had been born deaf and wanted to become a kindergarten teacher. The selection committee had called Emma, Sophie, and Grace to announce the recipient, and the three girls had cheered so loudly that Thomas had to apologize to the neighbors. But the most unexpected turn came a year after the original video. The school board, still eager to demonstrate its commitment to inclusion, had proposed a new initiative, a district-wide sign language day, where every student and staff member would learn a basic phrase and sign it simultaneously at noon. The event had been planned for a Friday in May, and it had attracted media attention from across the state. Laura had been asked to lead the event, standing on a stage in the high school auditorium with the triplets beside her. The phrase they would teach was the one that had started it all: "You are our friend." The morning of the event, Laura stood backstage with the girls. They were now 7 years old, still identical, still in matching dresses. Thomas had splurged on new blue ones for the occasion, and still utterly fearless in the way that only children who have already changed the world can be. Emma touched Laura's hand. "Are you nervous?" she signed. Laura nodded. "A little." Sophie tugged her sleeve. "We'll be right there with you." Grace quietly added, "You're ours, forever." The event was broadcast live on the district's website. Thousands of people watched. At exactly noon, Laura stepped onto the stage and raised her hands. In the auditorium, 1,500 students did the same. In classrooms across the district, on playgrounds and offices, people stopped what they were doing and signed. The drone footage, captured by a local TV station, showed an entire community moving their hands in unison. Laura, from the stage, looked out and saw a sea of faces, all signing the words that 3 little girls had once practiced in a bedroom mirror. But the true climax came after the event. Laura returned to Edgewood Elementary to find a package waiting for her on her desk. Inside were 4 identical certificates: Emma Foster, Sophie Foster, Grace Foster, and Laura Chen had been jointly awarded the Governor's Medal for Community Service, the highest civilian honor in the state. The accompanying letter noted that this was the first time in Illinois history that the medal had been awarded to a group that included children under the age of 10. A ceremony was scheduled at the state capitol in 2 weeks. And then the letter added a final detail that made Laura sit down in her chair and press her hand to her mouth, the same gesture that had been captured in the original video. The governor had personally donated $50,000 to the scholarship fund, and a bill was being introduced in the state legislature to make Illinois the first state in the nation to mandate basic sign language instruction in all public elementary schools. The triplets' act of kindness was on the verge of becoming law. When Thomas heard the news, he was in the garage, changing the oil on his truck. Emma came running outside, waving the letter. "Daddy, Daddy, we're going to the Capitol. Miss Laura is taking us." He wiped his hands on a rag and read the letter 3 times. Then he leaned against the truck and cried. He cried for the night his daughters had first asked why Miss Laura was alone. He cried for the weeks of practice, the grocery money spent on interpreters, the fear that he was failing as a father. He cried for the assistant principal who had tried to stop them, and for the school board that had listened. And he cried most of all because his daughters, his 3 little girls who had been abandoned by their mother and raised on a mechanic's salary, had done something that presidents and philanthropists had not. They had made the world kinder, one sign at a time. The Capitol ceremony was held on a Thursday in June. The rotunda was packed. Laura wore her burgundy turtleneck, the hearing aid visible, her dark hair pulled back. The triplets wore new blue dresses, floral this time, a gift from a designer who had followed the story from the beginning. The governor, a gray-haired woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, spoke about the power of small gestures to create massive change. She called the girls forward to accept the medal, and Emma, as always, took the lead. She signed "Thank you" to the governor, who signed it back. Sophie added, "We share this with everyone." And Grace, stepping up last, looked directly into the cameras and signed the words that had become her identity: "You are ours." The applause shook the marble walls. Laura stood behind the girls, her hands resting on their shoulders, and she realized something that she would later describe as the most powerful moment of her life. The isolation was gone, not just from the cafeteria, but from the deepest part of her soul. She had been seen. She had been claimed. And in claiming her, these 3 little girls had taught an entire world what it meant to truly include someone. The story could have ended there. It would have been a perfect ending: medals, legislation, tears, triumph. But the most remarkable chapter was still unfolding, and it began 3 weeks later in a moment that no one saw coming. Thomas had asked Laura to dinner. Not pizza with the kids, not a school event, but a real dinner at a restaurant with white tablecloths and candles. He had cleaned up remarkably well, his beard trimmed, his shirt pressed, his hands scrubbed free of grease. He picked her up at her apartment and drove her to a little Italian place on the riverfront. And halfway through the meal, with the sunset reflecting off the water, he reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm not good with words," he said, "but I've been thinking about something the girls said. You're ours, and I was wondering if you might want to be mine too." Laura didn't answer with words. She didn't sign, and she didn't write on her whiteboard. She just reached up and touched his face and nodded and smiled. The couple at the next table, who had no idea who they were, smiled too. Something in the air had shifted, something universal. But the final, astonishing twist came a year later, on a day that no one had planned. Laura and Thomas were married in a small ceremony at Edgewood Elementary, in the cafeteria that had once been a monument to loneliness. The tables were pushed back, the chairs arranged in a circle, and the entire staff and student body attended as guests. The triplets served as flower girls, wearing blue dresses that matched the ones they had worn on the day they changed everything. Miriam, now thriving as the school's second deaf teacher, served as maid of honor. And when the officiant asked Laura to speak, she signed her vows, and the entire room, students, teachers, staff, parents, signed back the single word that had rewritten the story of Edgewood Elementary: ours. That word, which had started as a secret practiced in a bedroom mirror, had become a family, a school, a community, a law, and the ripple effects were just beginning. But as the reception unfolded, Laura noticed something across the room that made her put down her glass of sparkling cider. A new student, a boy, maybe 6 years old, with hearing aids in both ears, was standing at the edge of the crowd looking lost. He had just transferred to Edgewood that week, and he didn't know anyone. Laura turned to find the triplets, but they were already moving. Emma, Sophie, and Grace, now almost 9 years old, had seen him too. They crossed the room together, 3 girls in blue, and stopped in front of him. Emma raised her hands. "Hi, what's your name?" The boy's face broke into a smile. And Laura, watching from across the room, felt her heart fill with the certainty that this endless, unstoppable cycle of noticing and including, was the real legacy of what 3 little girls had done on an ordinary afternoon in a school cafeteria. And that certainty was about to be tested one more time, in a way that no one could have predicted. Because sometimes, the smallest acts of love have the longest echoes, and the story that began with a deaf teacher eating alone was about to reach into places far beyond Illinois, touching lives that none of them had ever imagined, and proving once and for all that the language of belonging is the one we learn from those who refuse to let anyone be invisible. The cafeteria where Laura once ate alone is now the loudest room in the school, not with noise, but with connection. Teachers sign across tables. Students practice fingerspelling their names on whiteboards. And somewhere in the corner, where a foldable lunch tray used to rest on empty plastic, there is a permanent plaque now, placed by the school board without telling anyone. It reads, "You are ours." 3 words applied first to one woman, then to a second teacher, then to a little boy with hearing aids, and now to an entire community that learned inclusion is not a policy. It is a posture you take toward another person. Laura still teaches art. She still wears that burgundy turtleneck, even though she has a dozen now, gifted from strangers who saw a video and recognized themselves in her loneliness. The triplets are in 4th grade. They no longer match every day, but on certain mornings Thomas will walk into the kitchen and find all 3 in the same shade of blue, independent of each other, and he knows what that means. They are watching for someone new. The scholarship named after them has funded 4 future deaf educators so far. The Illinois Sign Language Bill passed into law 19 months after the school board vote. Other states have followed, and the story has been retold in classrooms from Portland to Manchester, a quiet anchor in a noisy world, reminding people that the smallest hands can carry the heaviest hope. But the real question of this story is not what 3 girls did. It is what we are doing, right now, today, with the people who eat alone in our own cafeterias and offices and neighborhoods. Laura was invisible not because she was deaf, but because no one chose to see her. The miracle was not sign language. The miracle was attention, and attention is free. It costs nothing to notice someone, to sit with them, to learn their language, whether that language is ASL or grief or silence. Emma, Sophie, and Grace did not set out to change laws or win medals. They just couldn't stand watching someone be unseen. That is the only qualification this kind of heroism requires. So the story of Edgewood Elementary is yours now. Watch it, share it, but more importantly, finish it in your own school, your own workplace, your own kitchen table. If you want to see what else can happen when ordinary people refuse to look away, click the video on your screen right now. And while you're here, hit subscribe. There is always another story worth noticing.